Welcome to another session of Officiating Wrestling by the Book. This module focuses on the concept of supporting points. So as always, we start with our key rule references from the NFHS rules book. Rule 5-15-2, the inbounds rule, actually provides us with the definition of supporting points. And from that rule, what we learn are the following. Supporting points are parts of the body. They bear the weight of the wrestler. They are parts that the parts that hold on to the opponent don't count. The shoulders are all of the supporting points for a defensive wrestler when they are, quote, on their back. Although I would like to substitute the term in near fall criteria as a more precise way of applying that. And whenever you look at this rule and think about supporting points, think about the physics and think about the center of gravity of the wrestler. Where is the weight at? Where is it being distributed? The next rule I want to reference is Rule 5-25, which is the takedown rule. And here's why. What that rule tells us is that when a majority of a defensive wrestler's weight is borne on a hand or hands, it is considered a supporting point. This is critical because a hand may be touching the mat, but what this rule is reinforcing is that that hand doesn't count as one of the main supporting points unless it has a majority of the wrestler's weight. Then Rule 7-3-3 on technical violations is a key rule as well, because it describes for us the locking hands violation and illustrates for us or emphasizes a particular concept that's useful, which is the concept of being down on the mat. So the violation for locked hands occurs by an offensive wrestler unless the opponent has all the weight supported entirely by the feet. That means 100% of the weight of that defensive wrestler is supported by their feet. They can't be posting a hand or a knee and one foot. They have to be completely on their feet. And so this is useful because it tells us when somebody is, quote, down on the mat. And Rule 5-15-2 gives us a list of what they call the usual points of support when somebody is down on the mat. So let's do a quick recap. How many supporting points does Red, the defensive wrestler in this picture, have? Let's count them. 1 is the right hand. 2 is the left hand. 3 is the right knee. 4 is the left knee. 5 is the right foot. And 6 is the left foot. So 6 supporting points according to our definition. And again, think about the physics of this. And think to yourself, where's the distribution of the weight of a wrestler in the various body positions you might observe them? So let's do a little illustration. These aren't intended to be completely scientific or engineered, just illustrative. So if we take a look at each of these pictures, we'll sort of peg where the weight is being distributed for the particular wrestler we're focused on. So in this case, green, let's see where his weight's distributed. Well, probably maybe 5% of his weight's on that left foot. It's kind of extended out. He's not pushing off or anything on it. It's just sort of resting on the mat there. Maybe 15% of his weight on that right hand, because looks like he may be posting it a little bit. And then let's say 80 or 85% of his weight on that right knee. You can tell he's driving most of the weight down right through that knee from his hips and his butt, because again, that's where his center of gravity is. That's where his heaviest muscles are. So his core weight is being borne primarily by that right knee. Let's take a look at the wrestler with the black singlet on here, attempting a takedown. Maybe 5% of his weight on that right toe or foot. It's not really driving or anything. It's just sort of resting there. let's say 25% of his weight on that left foot because he's going for a takedown. And he seems to be driving with the ball of his foot. And then let's call it 70% that's on that right knee. Again, his core weight is driving right through that knee to the mat. All right, let's look at this wrestler here in the red singlet. He's stretched out in sort of a plank position, trying to pin his opponent there on his toes and sort of on his left elbow. So probably 10% of his weight or so is on those toes, because in that position, when he's perfectly parallel to the mat in that plank type position, all of his body weight exists between the bottom of his feet and the top of his head, right? So not much of his weight can be supported all the way down on his feet. If this person, let's say, is 6 feet tall, there's 6 feet of person above where those toes are. So let's call it 10% is borne by those toes. Probably 30% of his weight is up there in his chest, resting on that elbow. And really the majority of his weight is there where his hips are. Even though they're not really touching the mat, that's where his weight is coming down, though. We know that because those are the heaviest muscles in his body. So I want to make a critical distinction here. I want to make a distinction between just the generic term supporting points and what we'll call the supporting points. So remember, by rule, any body part bearing weight can be classified as a supporting point. Think back a couple slides when we counted that a wrestler on his hands and knees had 6 supporting points according to the rule, because both hands, both knees, both feet, they were all bearing some weight, right? But the NFHS cares about a maximum of only 2 supporting points for a wrestler, and we're going to refer to those as the supporting points. The supporting points are those which bear a majority of the weight. And remember, when we read Rule 5-25, the takedown rule, that's what reinforced this principle, because remember how the hand or the hands wouldn't count as a supporting point unless they were bearing a majority of the weight. So that tells us what the principle at play here is, that we don't really care about any more than 2 supporting points, and they have to be the ones that are bearing the majority of the weight, not just incidental body parts touching the mat. And then by exception, Rule 5-15-2 told us that the shoulders or scapula are the supporting points when the wrestler is on their back. I like to say in near fall criteria, even though we know that they may not be bearing the majority of their weight when they're on their back like that on their shoulders. And finally, the supporting points for a wrestler, he could have 0, 1, or 2. And let's see how that happens. So let's look at some examples of when a wrestler has 2 supporting points. Let's look at the wrestler in the light colored singlet in the defensive starting position there. What are his 2 supporting points? Well, it's both of his knees. Remember, physics, center of gravity, body mass, his hips, his butt, that's where his heaviest muscles are. That's where the majority of his weight's born, is through those knees. How about the wrestler on the left-hand side there in the center circle? Well, obviously both hit his feet, right? When he's standing straight up like that, perpendicular to the mat, all of his weight is driving down through his body, through his feet to the mat. And then how about this defensive wrestler? Well, since he's in near fall criteria, then according to Rule 5-15-2, by exception, we will now consider both shoulders to be the supporting points. All right, how about some examples of when they have only 1 supporting point? The wrestler in green, what's his supporting point? Well, it's obvious. He's just sitting on his buttocks there. The wrestler in the red singlet, this is easy too. Only body part he has in contact with the mat is that left foot. And so all of his weight's driving down into that 1 foot. And then how about this wrestler applying the cradle, laying on his side there? Well, the side of his thigh or his hip, that's his one supporting point. Because again, that's where the mass of his body is driving through there into the mat. But what about zero supporting points? Well, it's actually pretty simple, right? For red, he's not even on the mat anymore because his opponent's lifted him off. So he doesn't have any body parts in contact with the mat. He has none of them are bearing his weight. Same with this guy getting lifted off the mat here. Once he's completely off the mat, now he has zero supporting points. So here's a little trick for identifying what the supporting points are for a wrestler. It's sort of a little theoretical exercise. But let's start again with this green wrestler, the guy on the bottom, and let's figure out what his supporting points are. So in this technique, imagine that the wrestler is suspended in midair above the mat. Then ask yourself this question. How does this wrestler achieve that position on the mat by placing only one body part in contact with the mat at a time and stopping no later than the moment a second body part touches the mat? So in this case, let's put his right knee down first and then his right hand. At the moment you stop, give the wrestler 5 seconds to come to rest. And then once he settles, that will reveal what the supporting points are, because they'll be the last one or ones which have touched the mat. So in this case, after 5 seconds, he's going to probably remain in that same position on just the right knee and the right hand. So those are probably the supporting points for this wrestler. He's not going to fall over. He could stay on that right knee and that right hand. So let's walk through a couple of examples. First, an easy example. The wrestler in red on the right-hand side there. So if we use our little technique and suspend him in midair first, put his left foot down on the mat. Then put his right foot down on the mat and stop. That's his second body part. Wait 5 seconds. And obviously he still remains on his feet. Thus, his feet are the supporting points, his 2 feet. Let's look at a slightly more complex example. The blue wrestler, the defensive wrestler here. Again, he's suspended above the mat. And first thing we'll do is put his left knee down on the mat. Then we'll place his left hand down on the mat. That's his second body part, so stop right there. Now we wait 5 seconds and let him settle out. And lo and behold, he's probably still able to stay on that one knee and one hand. Thus, in this example, we could say that his left knee and his left hand, those are the supporting points for this wrestler. But it's legitimate to ask yourself, could he potentially lift his left hand off the mat in that position? Maybe, if he's not really leaning into that hand too much. So maybe he only has one supporting point. Maybe it's just the left knee. Or maybe because he's got that right foot on the mat and maybe he's driving into his opponent, maybe that's becoming a supporting point. There's room for interpretation here. All right, let's look at a more complex example now. The wrestler in black who's stretched out in that plank position, parallel to the mat, attempting a takedown here on the edge of the mat. So first, let's suspend him in midair above the mat, and let's take the opponent out of the equation, because the parts where he's holding the opponent don't count as supporting points. And first, we'll place his right toes on the mat with his body fully extended. Then his left toes on the mat with his body fully extended and stop, because that's the second body part. Now we'll wait 5 seconds. Now, as we first put him there, imagine that his body was still a few inches above the mat. But now we're waiting to see how he settles out after 5 seconds in that position where only his toes are touching the mat at the moment and he's perfectly parallel to the mat, a few inches above the mat. Well, 5 seconds later, guess what? Splat. He falls to the mat. And when he does, where he comes to rest is on his hip or maybe on his elbows or something. But his His supporting point is not his toes or his feet. Again, remember, all of his weight is located somewhere much further up his body. And because his body is parallel to the mat, that means the toes can't be supporting a majority of his weight. So keep in mind that in this plank position, the toes cannot possibly support the majority of the weight and cannot be the supporting points. And we see from the NFHS rules clinic for the year 2017-2018 that they emphasize this, because they make the note that the wrestlers, and again, this wrestler in the red singlet who's on his toes trying to pin this guy, that the toes are not the supporting points when he's down on the mat in this position. Matter of fact, the NFHS has never considered the toes as supporting points while they're down on the mat, and most especially when they're stretched out like this. So let's do a recap of what we've covered. Remember our key rule references. 5-15-2, the inbounds rule, talks about the definition of supporting points. Rule 5-25, takedown, instructed us that we wouldn't count a hand or hands as supporting points unless they bore a majority of the weight. So that introduced to us and reinforced the principle that the supporting points for a wrestler are the ones that are bearing the majority of the weight, not just incidental body parts touching the mat. And then Rule 7-3-3 on technical violation, in this case for locking hands, helped us to understand the concept or the difference between being down on the mat versus when the weight is entirely supported on the feet. That at that point, then that's when the wrestler is no longer, quote, down on the mat. Again, the supporting points bear the majority of the weight for the wrestler. And that's because of the physics and center of gravity that's at play when we're trying to assess where the supporting points are. Think about that weight distribution. Remember that the NFHS is concerned about a maximum of only 2 supporting points for a wrestler, and that a wrestler can have either 0, 1, or 2 supporting points, and we showed examples of each. And lastly, we learned a little mental game that we can play, an approach for identifying what the supporting points for a wrestler are. So that's our lesson today on supporting points.